Wow, kind of hard to start without being emotional. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today about poetry, to help celebrate National Poetry Writing Month. First, I know that I am not the only person in this room who writes poetry. What I'm about to offer is my journey based on my experience, but I know others of you have different paths. Today, I'm going to talk first about my journey and some of what I'm learning. Second, I'll touch on where my poems come from. And finally, third, I'll talk a little about how poetry has helped me deal with loss. I grew up in a family that valued reading and writing. I remember a framed quote on the wall from a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be." Those two simple lines reflected and perhaps also influenced the loving environment in our family. Both my parents wrote poetry. I have an unpublished collection of light-hearted poems my dad wrote during and after the war. One poem written when my mom was pregnant with me, about 8 months pregnant. I was the first child, and the poem starts with the lines, "God in his heaven took Sarah and John down from the pegs they were hanging upon." In my dad's poem, God has to decide which child to send first. And these are the last 4 lines. "So God tossed a coin to decide the affair. It fell like a glittering star through the air, and after it came in a sparkle of joy, the soul of a girl or a little boy." And incidentally, my brother John was taken off his peg a year after me. My mother's poetry was more serious than my dad's. Here's an example, a few lines of a poem about autumn in a forest of birch and poplar. "This fall is a fall of coin, a tumble of stars that must have slid from some spiraling, blushing galaxy, a chute of medallions cascading down the walls of the forest." So I inherited poetic genes from both parents. I recall an early poem that I wrote in high school, full of teen angst. When I had to submit it to the teacher, I was embarrassed at how it revealed my feelings. It was Centennial Year, 1967, and guess what? Canada's nationhood was a big topic. So I titled my poem, "Canada the Adolescent," as if I were talking about Canada's turmoil rather than my own. Here's the poem's last 3 lines. "I want what I have not got, but I do not know what it is I want or what it is I have not got." When the teacher gave it back to me, he'd written at the top, "This, of course, is satire, very effective." The fact I still remember that incident decades later tells me I must have been quite disappointed in the teacher's interpretation, but it didn't stop me because I kept on writing, and here I am. The story illustrates 2 points about poetry. The first is that when I share a poem that I've written, I'm inviting you as reader or listener to take it into your world and make it yours. My teacher read my poem through the lens of his experience and his perceptions, not mine. So it was no longer my poem. He thought I was being earnest. I was being earnest, but he thought I was satirical. And that story also illustrates a second aspect of poetry, and that is its mystery. The words not said, the spaces that are created, leave a poem open to interpretation. There's no single correct way to interpret a poem, despite what teachers in school might have said. In a poem, the poet hints at the unknowable, ideas and concepts that perhaps are beyond the ability of words to express. Reading and writing poetry, I'm taking this, thinking about our Unitarian principles now, they're consistent with our third and our fourth principles, encouraging spiritual growth and a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Emily Dickinson advised poets to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Poems are indirect. They don't hit you over the head with their themes. The more indirect they are, sometimes the harder they are to understand. And this can make poetry intimidating for readers. But that very indirectness allows you or me as the reader to participate in the poetic process, especially if we are prepared to put a little effort into closely reading the poem. Poems are about language and how words sound, their musicality, the rhythm they make. Here's an example from Under the Moon, another very early poem I wrote over 40 years ago about the birth of my first child, Rebecca. Here are the first 3 stanzas. I'm just going to do a few excerpts so that I can cover more ground today. So the first 3 stanzas. In the dark of the moon, in the month of the year, I wait. In the room, in the house, in the chair by the fire, I rest. On the cloth for the gown of the babe, when it comes, I stitch. It was a simple poem with the flavor of a nursery rhyme, and without realizing it, I'd unconsciously captured the rhythm of a rocking cradle. Like that one, many of my poems have been generated from emotion as a way of expressing love, anger, sadness, fear. When I felt I was floundering as a parent or was anxious as my children ventured into the world, I wrote poetry. Here's an excerpt from an angry poem I wrote about a relationship long past, titled Think of Me Not, again an excerpt. Think of me not as you inhaled me when you took my voice and made it yours. Do not think me into you or into something I am not. My silence is not assent, my shadow not yours to assume. I definitely was not telling it slant in that poem. One description I read said that poets are teaching us what we already know, but didn't know we knew. So poetry is kind of an awakening to knowledge in our subconscious, and we have that aha moment when the poem resonates. Since those early years, I've continued to write poetry. Many poems of mine are rooted in nature and are kind of a both and. I express both my sadness at losses in the natural world and the wonder I feel when I examine small miracles of life. I still write from intense experience, but I'm learning to touch on universal themes which connect the reader. Here's some examples of what I mean. A few years ago, I spent a profound emotional time with a friend in the last months of her life. When she died, I wrote and rewrote a poem about the experience. Initially, I focused on her cat, who was an important part of her life and was present at her passing. Then I began to widen the gaze of the poem from beyond just my friend. Here's some of the poem, If I Forget to Tell You. If I forget to tell you, remind me to talk on my last day of benediction to all I love, to you and to my children, and to the struggling man next door who pushes his wheelchair with sad arms and bumps with difficulty up the curb, a trip to the store, once so easy, now an epic journey. And on my last day, remind me of how my mother smiled at her end, quiet, eyes shining blue, how love begets love. And if I forget to tell you, I want to leave this world the way Kath left, her furry black and white cat, a feline doula astride her lap, her sons on either side, each holding a hand as she passed her last loving energy to them. Yet, perhaps I'll leave without notice, surprised, and there won't be time to say it all. But you will know I wanted to. Okay, the next poem was triggered by another intense time I spent with my niece while she recovered from birthing twins. Again, I tried to widen the poem's gaze when I gave it the metaphorical title, How a Wound Heals. And in this case, I'm going to read the whole poem. A deep wound has to heal from the inside out. Stitch it shut to staunch the bleeding, and underneath blood pools, till soon it has nowhere to go but must seep out, crimson stains spreading across the white bandage, and soon enough there's more and nothing's healed at all. It's what we want to do, stitch things shut, make them look clean and neat. But no, a great hurt, like say, after a child or maybe two have been cut from the womb, those injuries need faith that cells will knit together without stitches, slow layer building on slow layer, and every day a little less blood on the bandage, till one day the nurse who comes to change the dressing says, "This is the best it's looked." And she, with her healing belly, snuggles close the babes, hungry and growing. Poets often describe an unconscious aspect to the writing process. Some of you may recall my poem about the Adams River salmon run, published in our newsletter some time ago. I wrote this poem after I'd spent almost 2 weeks at the river for a project. I was moved by the visceral experience of the crimson salmon flinging themselves upstream, the sea of fins flashing in the sun, the ammonia smell of decaying salmon, and the thousands of people drawn to the river. In the poem, I wondered what attracted so many tourists and compared them to pilgrims. Then I found myself sliding into a meditation on the cycle of life. I did not know when I started writing I would end up there. And as the poem expanded, it connected with others in a deeper way than had it only described the river and the salmon. Here are the last few lines of that poem. We come because we know, our bodies know. We are salmon. We are flowing river. Salmon blood is our blood. Sun-whitened skeletons are our bones. We come not because salmon are different, but because we are they. I've talked a little about my journey and where my poems come from. The final thing I want to touch on is how writing poetry has become a way of connecting with joy and how it's helped me deal with loss. Some of you know that before I moved to Victoria, I was a road cyclist. I loved cycling the quiet rural roads of the interior, pushing my body through pain and fatigue, and then reaching that euphoric state that some call a runner's high. I was captivated by the flow and the rhythmic cadence of pedaling, and sometimes I felt I was dancing with my bike. But then we moved to Victoria. Cycling here takes non-stop focus on everything from vehicles to other cyclists to walkers and dogs and scooters. I could no longer just hop on my bike and speed along in a meditative, blissful state. Rather than being a source of joy, cycling was stressful. And on top of that, because of osteoporosis, I was risking serious injury should I fall. I gradually realized I needed to let go of cycling and everything it meant. The day I sold my bike had the finality of a sad goodbye. But I can still walk, and for that I'm grateful, and I write poems. When I'm outside, I often find poetic inspiration from what I observe and pay attention to, from a homeless man sorting cans at the back of the grocery store, to a line of daycare children all wearing pink hats, toddling on the sidewalk 2 by 2. Last April, during National Poetry Writing Month, I challenged myself to write 30 poems in 30 days about what I noticed, such as those toddlers and that homeless man, while I walked local neighborhoods. I like the focus and the detail of poetry where less is more, where every word counts and has to work in service to the poem. There's a simple, pure beauty in poetry that can be hard to find in other writing. It's like how a talented sketch artist can portray the essence of a person with just a few well-placed pen strokes. Poetry has also given me connections with other poets. I never thought I might one day spend hours, even days, sitting with other poets and discussing our work, giving and receiving feedback right down to the individual word. Those times are immense gifts. Reading and writing poetry is also a meditative exercise that helps improve my mental health in this time of environmental and political turmoil. I often finish the day reading, rereading, thinking about a poem, trying to understand it, and might start the next day in the same way. I found several websites which have free subscriptions to a daily poem without having to search. So I can receive a fresh poem every day. And the beauty of that is that there are many different voices, many different perspectives, and that really helps keep me out of my silo of thinking. I find inspiration, beauty, and spiritual discipline in reading and writing poetry. It helps keep me stable, grounded, and gives me joy. I look forward to hearing your stories and thoughts about poetry in the forum, and I know that there's at least a couple of you that have brought short poems. Thank you.